We're going to look at an alternative way of constructing a visual search system using this approach in sparse key points and interest point detection. And we're going to see how that idea can be leveraged to produce a system that is invariant not only to translation but also rotation and scaling. In particular, we're going to look at a way of detecting these key points or interesting points sparsely in an image using something called a Harris corner detector. And we're going to look briefly at SIFT and something called bag of visual words, which is a way of constructing an image descriptor from these features detected in an image. If there's time, we'll talk about k-means. There may not be. Right, some of these slides are just recaps, so I'm going to skim through up to this one. So recall from the previous hour, we were looking at this approach around spatial gridding of images. And if you remember, we were splitting the image up into these equal-sized grid cells and computing within each cell some kind of descriptor relating to the texture or colour or both, and using those to form our image descriptor. And if you recall, this was just one of many ways of computing an image descriptor, and the basic idea was, given some way of computing this image descriptor, we map every image in our database into this high-dimensional space, and then giving a query that we want to search with, we apply the same algorithm to map into that space and then go measure the distance between that query and every point in our data set, ranking on that distance. So closer distances rank higher. So the limitation of the approaches that I've covered so far is, first of all, there's an element of uncertainty and experimentation around the granularity of this grid. If we produce a really coarse grid, then we will create a little bit of invariance to translation. Imagine I've just taken that entire image and just split it into 4 chunks, 4 grid cells. The cow's going to be able to move a little bit without affecting the score too much of the visual search system, the descriptor that's produced. But it's not going to be very discriminative in terms of the objects it can tell the difference between. Alternatively, if I create a really fine-grained grid, it's going to give me many cells. It will give me poor compactness, and in fact it might also give me poor discrimination, because just slight shifts of the object will give me very different descriptors. So this idea of producing a spatial grid then over an image is good for a sort of demonstration of a visual search system and a coursework and so on, but in practical terms it's not very good for a visual search system, because it's sensitive to shifting or translation of the object, rotation of the object, and scaling of the object in the image. So, if I took a photo from a different viewpoint, that would probably be enough to throw a system like this off. So, ideally, we would like a visual search system that is robust to these transformations that occur to the image when, for example, we move closer to it, take a picture from a different viewpoint, and so on. We call this class of transformation the affine transformations. Okay, and what we would like is to come up with an image descriptor that is invariant to, so not sensitive to, these kinds of transformations, which we therefore call it an affine invariant image descriptor. So I'm going to introduce now an alternative way of computing image descriptors that collects together information from interesting points that have been detected in the image. These interesting points are sometimes just called interest points or key points, and they tend to be points that are reproducibly identifiable between different viewpoints of the same image. So if I were to take these photos here of Bath Abbey, I think it is, and I were to look at different points in this image, there are certain pixels in here corresponding to features that are going to be readily identifiable between viewpoints, and certain pixels that aren't. So let's suppose I looked at a point here in this image, in the sky here, and I asked you, find me that bit of sky in the photo I took from a different viewpoint. I think you're going to struggle to be able to do that, okay, because this region is pretty devoid of texture, of structure in the image. Now, if I were to point to this part here on the side of the abbey and say to you, find me that point in the other image, you're going to do a reasonably good job. You're probably going to look at the image and say, well, it's here, or maybe it's here or here, and you're going to be able to localize it certainly to a better degree than my previous question, but it's still going to have a degree of uncertainty as to exactly where along this edge you're going to tell me that exact corresponding point is. But if I were to point to a feature here, like this corner here in the image, and say, find me this in the other viewpoint, you're going to, with a good degree of certainty, be able to tell me that it's here. Okay, and this tells us that points, like corners in an image, in other words, points of high intensity curvature in an image are readily identifiable between images. And so one way of identifying these interest points or key points, which form the basis for matching images taken from two different viewpoints, is to try, a good solution is to try and find corners in the image. And this is why we're going to talk now about something called the Harris corner detector, which is a method for finding corners, or as we'll see, more generally points of high curvature, intensity curvature in an image, that was developed actually in the late 80s, but is still used to some degree today. Let's just zoom in then on each of those kinds of artifact that I pointed out in the image and look to see what the pixel distribution looks like. Now in a flat region, as I say, if I were to look within a certain window, a little window of pixels around that point I asked you to find in the other image, you would see there's very little texture variation at all within that flat region. If I looked in a window established around an edge, you'd see that there is change in one direction, intensity variation in one direction, but little intensity change in the other direction. But with a corner, there's intensity change in both directions. Can you see that? Okay, so that's an important observation when we come to talk about this Harris corner detector. So the idea of the Harris corner detector is to be able to place a window around a point in an image, a pixel in an image, and make a decision as to whether the texture captured within that window describes a corner or not. And it gives you like a score as to how corner-like that pixel is. The way it calculates this score is by performing something that sounds a bit fancy called autocorrelation. Okay? But actually all autocorrelation means is calculating the difference of a patch in that image with another patch sampled from that image. And the specific operation the Harris corner detector does is it takes that window localized around a point we want to measure the cornerness of, and it calculates the difference of that window with another window cut slightly higher and slightly to the right of, so a little delta x and delta y of that position. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay, so in other words, what it does is it calculates, if I pick a point in my image, let's call it xi, yi, let's pick a point in my image, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's suppose that point is xi, yi, I've got a function I, which returns the grayscale value of that pixel location. So this is an operation that's performed on grayscale images, so we have to convert our image to grayscale before we do any of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that pixel and I'm going to difference it with a pixel that is slightly offset in the x and the y direction from that particular point. I'm going to square that difference, and I'm going to sum up the results of doing that differencing operation for all of the locations within that window. Does that make sense? So that's what this I subscript is. It's meant to indicate an indexing over all of the pixels within this window, which we'll call W here. Does that make sense? So what we're effectively doing is calculating something we call the sum of squared difference, or SSD, between a window established around a point and another window that's established around a point slightly offset from it. Does that make sense? Okay. We call that autocorrelation. Right. Now, as I've said before, the important thing to note is that in the region that is flat, the autocorrelation of this region with the region next to it is going to give me almost no sum of squared difference at all. If I shift in the x and the y direction, I'm still just going to see flat texture. There's going to be very little change here. It's like if I established this window on this wall here and I moved it slightly, I wouldn't really see anything moving in the window. If I have a window established over an edge here, I move it this way in the y direction, the texture is going to appear to be static, but I move it this way and I'll see a difference. But around a corner, I'm going to see difference if I move in both directions. So, the Harris corner detector then is trying to figure out a score for how likely it is we're localized around a corner. We're going to take this equation that I just described to you, and we're going to unpack it using a Taylor expansion of this term here. Now, Taylor expansion, for those of you, hopefully most people are familiar with Taylor expansion, but it's a way of taking an expression that is expressed in terms of a small delta on its input, in this case x and y, its input domain, and expressing that in terms of a change in its output domain. So I of x plus some delta x, y plus some delta y, yeah, so this position plus some small offset from it, is approximately equal, under a Taylor expansion, to the value of I at that point plus this residual term. Okay, and this residual term then is related to the first derivative of this function I. Now, how do we calculate the first derivative of an image? Thinking back to week 1, how do we differentiate an image, and what will that give us? Well, differentiating an image gives us a measure of how much that image is changing in its x and its y direction. So it's calculating the edge information, the change in the image. So I'm using here this subscript x and this subscript y to represent the results of taking this image I and convolving it with one of our edge detection filters, like Sabel filter, okay, that we covered during week 1. So to remember my I here is an image, okay, which I'm indexing by x and y. My I subscript x is the result of taking that image and convolving it with the delta I delta x Sabel filter, yeah, which is your 1 0 minus 1, 2 0 minus 2, 1 0 minus 1 filter, okay. And IY is the same, is taking our image in grayscale and convolving it with the other Sabel filter, yeah, to give us our delta I delta y. And then we're just point sampling pixels from it. Yeah? So I x plus delta x, y plus delta y is approximately equal to the value of the image at that point, xi, yi, plus the value of its first derivative image computed through that Sabel convolution at xy, respectively. The result of taking those and multiplying them with the amount of shift we have, which would typically be 1 pixel. So this is written then as an inner product. So these are 2 values here, sampled from those 2 results of the convolution. So 2 numbers, and that is an inner product with this vector here, which is the amount of the change of x, the change in y. Is everyone happy with that? That's not an exact Taylor expansion. Taylor expansion is infinite, but that's just the first order Taylor expansion. So, if we were to substitute that result back into this equation for this term, we would take all of that into here, and we would get this expression here. And we can immediately see that these 2 terms are going to cancel out. Yeah? So this equation then, this expression for the autocorrelation of the image, is going to be equivalent simply to the summation over this, because these 2 have cancelled, which is this. And because we observe it's a squared quantity, we can just drop the sign, the negative sign. Yeah? So that expression at the bottom then is a close approximation then, under the Taylor expansion, to this expression at the top. But it has the advantage of being readily computable from the first derivative of that image, which we get through a convolution through the Sabel filter, or similar. Has anyone got any questions on that? Okay. So one way we can express or rewrite that equation, that squared equation there, is as again an inner product between, but this time between the delta x, delta y and itself, multiplied by this 2 by 2 matrix here, which has a special name. We call it the structure tensor. It looks more complicated, but it's quite simple what's going on. Again, we're just point sampling these images that we've got from our convolution with our delta x and our delta y by image. These are our first derivatives of our image with respect to x and y. We're point sampling here the x value, squaring it, point sampling the y value, squaring it, and then these off-diagonal entries are the x and the y multiplied together. Okay, so this then gives us a value that we can compute about a point xy. Yeah, a window centered on some point xy. that make sense? So, in concrete terms, what do I do to compute this Harris corner detector score for a region? I take my image, grayscale it, run the grayscale image through a convolution with the two Sabel filters for delta I, delta x, delta I, delta y. That gives me my ix and my iy values. And then for a given region, I'm interested in computing the corner score for. Okay, I just sum up by sampling from those two images, those two outputs of that convolution. Okay, so that structured tensor there encodes the covariance of the grayscale values within the image, within that region of the image, that W. Now, as we know, a covariance matrix, we can decompose that covariance matrix into eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And in this case, it's a 2 by 2 matrix, so we can perform eigendecomposition to get 2 eigenvectors and 2 eigenvalues, right? We got that from last week. So, if I were to look at this, let's say we take this edge patch here, which I've just computed that covariance matrix over. If I were to compute the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of this patch, which direction would the principal eigenvector point in? Which direction does the principal eigenvector always point in? The direction of greatest variation, the distribution, which in this case is this direction, yeah? And the other eigenvector is always orthogonal to it, okay? What is the eigenvalue going to look like in this direction? It's going to look big, right? What about this direction? It's going to be like small, virtually zero, because there's no variation in this direction. So, if I take that covariance matrix and perform eigendecomposition on it, and I look at its eigenvalues, I'm expecting to see both eigenvalues to be large only in the situation where we've got variation, large variation along both of the eigenvectors. In other words, where we've got a corner. If we see only one of the eigenvalues being large and the other small, we've got an edge. And if both the eigenvalues are low, then there's very little variation at all in that patch, so it's a flat region. Does that make sense? So the corners are likely to be present when both eigenvalues are high. Does everyone see why that's the case? Any questions on that? Okay. So a quick test then to say, is an eigenvalue, this is the test that Harris and Stevens proposed in their paper that introduced this idea, is to say if the product of the two eigenvalues is much larger than the sum of the two eigenvalues, then there's a corner present. Okay? It's a way of basically detecting if the two eigenvectors are high. Eigenvalues, are high. Now, as we talked about last week, the product of the eigenvalues of a matrix is equal to its determinant. And as we talked about last week, the trace of a matrix is equal to the sum of its eigenvalues. So this expression is equivalent to saying if the determinant of my matrix, which is my covariance matrix, that 2 by 2 matrix I created by sampling from my convolution results, if the determinant of that matrix is much larger than the trace of that matrix, there's a corner there. In other words, if the determinant of that matrix minus the trace of that matrix, pre-multiplied by some scaling factor, which is like a kind of a fudge factor that you just put into the paper, which empirically he said, let's use 0.04, okay, everyone does, okay, then if this expression is high, then we consider it likely that there's a corner present. Engineers love these things, yeah. Well, as I just said, it's chosen empirically by Harris and Stevens to be an appropriate scaling factor for getting a good decision out of this process. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, what if the corner is somewhere else? Okay, so the important thing to note here is we're calculating the eigenvalues of this grayscale distribution, yeah, and along each of the eigenvectors. So if that corner was oriented differently, rotated differently, it was like there in the image, or there in a different place, then those eigenvalues would move with the corner. Those eigenvectors would move with the corner, and then the eigenvalues along them would just be the same. So this shows actually that this measure is rotationally invariant. I can rotate the image and I'm still going to get the same result. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, well, it doesn't really matter what range the grayscale values have, because you're just computing the variation in those values. So it doesn't matter like if they're normalized over 0 to 1 or over 0 to 255. Normally, to do this sort of stuff, we do normalize it first. Yeah. 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 Well, so the idea is if I've got two numbers, if one number's big and one number's small, and I multiply them together, I get a small number out. So I'm only going to get a big result from this if both numbers are big. So this is a way of saying, are both eigenvalues big, basically? It'll give me a big number, otherwise it'll give me a small number. It's just a, back in the day, this is sort of engineering hacks people did. Anyway, it works quite well. So this is the result then of taking this image here and calculating that corner score for a small window, a 3x3 window, placed at every position in that image. Here I've used a heat map to show sort of warmer colours where that corner score is higher, is larger. Okay, and you can see that you've got larger responses here around corners or points of high curvature, at least in the image. But this is not yet telling us where the main interest points, where the main corners are in the image. It's just giving us a heat map over the likelihood of different parts of the image being a corner. So one way that we can convert that into corners is to look at what we call local maxima of the field. So if I were to take, having produced this image with my sliding window approach, if I were to then take another sliding window and 3x3 and place it at every position in this image, what I could say is that I'm going to declare that there's a corner present if the pixel I've centered that window on is larger than all of the other pixels in the window. So if the center pixel is larger than the pixels surrounding it. In that case, that window will be centered on what we call a local maxima, and the value of that middle of that window, of that maxima, is going to be the strength of that corner. Okay. So in this next slide then, I have an image where there's a little cross placed at every point that one of those local maxima were detected. But I've also sorted the corners according to the value of that local maxima, and I've only displayed the top 200 corners, the 200 strongest corners that have been detected. And if you look at the image, which has been taken now from 2 points of view, these corners have clustered in a reproducible way around the interest points in that image. As you can see, they cover more than just corners, so we shouldn't... It was called originally the Harris corner detector, but people usually refer to it now as the Harris interest point detector because it's just picking up points of high curvature. But these are points that are likely to be matchable between the images when taken from different points of view. Does that make sense? So, how do we use this detector to build a visual search system? Well, what we could do is for every corner we could sample a little patch of texture around that corner and then we could compute some descriptor from it. So we could compute like a color histogram or maybe an edge orientation histogram within a window of fixed size around each of those interest points. That would give me a little fingerprint of the texture in the image local to each of those corners. Yeah, does that make sense? But how could I combine those little fingerprints of all those little interest points together to create an image descriptor I can fit into my visual search framework? There's no immediately obvious way of doing that because what order would I concatenate them in to make my big long vector? Yeah? There's no kind of reproducible way of visiting these corners in order. Now, I could start from the top left, but then if I've taken the image from a different viewpoint, that top left corner might be later than another corner that's occurred. So it's hard to see how they would be concatenated naively into a big long vector as we discussed before. So in order to aggregate those local sparse features into an image descriptor, what we need to do is use a technique we call bag of visual words. And in order to describe that technique, we have to take a quick diversion into the field of text retrieval, where this idea was stolen/borrowed from. Okay, so if we were building, I don't know, some sort of Google or something like that, some web search system or document similarity system, one way of taking a fingerprint of a document, a page of text, is to create a frequency histogram of the word occurrence in that text. So if I've got this page of text here taken from the War of the Worlds, written locally, so I have to use it, okay, I'm going to create this histogram here, and these are words that I've picked out to be part of my representation, and I'm going to count how many times the word by and, are going to occur. Probably it's going to occur a lot more than Eve, but anyway, it's just a thing I drew in PowerPoint. And maybe Martians doesn't occur very often because anyway, that distribution, that frequency histogram, is like a fingerprint of the content of that page. Yeah? Now, you'll notice immediately that that representation has thrown away the spatial relationships between those words. It's just counting up how often each of those words occurs. So it doesn't preserve order. The other important thing to consider with this representation is which words we choose to build this frequency histogram with, what we call the dictionary. Okay? Clearly we want to choose a dictionary that contains discriminative words. Probably it would be a bad idea, in fact, to build a dictionary that contains words like the and, because that's going to occur pretty much in every English language piece of text. But other words perhaps are more valuable to include in that dictionary. Right, so does everyone see how this is a way that we can take a fingerprint of a page of text? What we could do is concatenate the heights of those bins into a big long vector, and that's then a point in some high dimensional space that characterizes the content of that page of text, yeah? Alright. Now, as I say, in about 2004, computer vision people kind of looked at this and thought, we can use this idea. So, we came up with, not me of course, some other people, came up with this idea called bag of visual words. And the idea here is to build a frequency histogram based on the occurrences of different patches of texture. So instead of using words, we're using different kinds of texture as the bins in our histogram. Unfortunately, I did have a nice little animation of that to show you, but that doesn't seem to work. Anyway, the point of the visualization that doesn't seem to work is if I were to collect lots of little patches of texture in this image, we'd see that there's quite a lot of water texture, quite a lot of sky texture, a little bit of boat texture, and so on. And collectively, that histogram I could produce would characterize the content of that image. Yeah, does that make sense? So how do we decide on the words or what kinds of texture should form the dictionary, i.e. should form the bins of that histogram? Well, this is the framework we use. This is the pipeline for calculating bag of visual words. The first thing we do is we take all of the images in our data set and we apply the Harris corner detector or some other interest point detector to that image in order to detect these interest points. Then, local to each interest point, we sample that local descriptor from texture from the local to that point to create that fingerprint of texture local to that interest point. We do that for all of these interest points across all of the images in our data. So we get a huge amount of points in our feature space. Remember, a point here corresponds to a fingerprint from a patch of texture local to each of those interest points. Does that make sense? Yeah? So I'm going to get potentially millions of these points in this high dimensional space. I'm then going to apply an algorithm, and we'll come to it later, called k-means clustering algorithm. K-means clustering algorithm, I'll explain how it works later, if there's time, if not next lecture. The k-means clustering algorithm is our first example we're going to come to on this course of an unsupervised clustering algorithm. It just takes data, a data distribution, and figures out how to group it into clusters, into groups. It's called k-means because it will group the data into k clusters, and you, as the designer of the system, give it the k. So you say, okay, k-means, here's my distribution, split it up into k clusters. And typically for a bag of visual words visual search system, that might be 1,000 or 2,000 clusters. Okay, so k would be 1,000 or 2,000. Okay, so those points will then be grouped into these clusters, and these clusters are these words in our dictionary, what we call code words. Okay, they are the bins that we're going to create our frequency histogram out of. So if I were to look at this particular image here of the mountains, what I would see is, for all of these interest points, every one of these interest points, based on the texture around it, maps to a point in this feature space. And I can see, where which cluster that point is part of. Yeah, that's these clusters having been produced by this black box I haven't described yet, called the K-means clustering algorithm. So, for example, this point might be part of this cluster. So that would be a +1 when I build my frequency histogram for that particular visual word. And I go through every interest point in my image, figuring out which code word it falls into, and then add one to my histogram in order to produce this distribution, which tells me the frequency of the visual words, these code words, within my image. Does that make sense? So there will be K bins, where K is the number of clusters. The heights of these bins then, I can extract and concatenate into a big long vector, a K-dimensional vector, so potentially a 1,000-dimensional vector. And that then is my image descriptor that characterizes the content of the whole image. In fact, what I normally do is what I should always do is normalize that descriptor. So I divide this histogram again. Every bin gets divided by the sum of the bins, in other words, the number of interest points in the image. Does that make sense? Can everyone see the analogy here between this system and the text retrieval system? The text retrieval system is counting the occurrences of words on a page. This system is counting the occurrences of visual words in an image. But we've done this analysis in order to figure out what the visual words are. So this might be a cluster corresponding to water texture. This might be the sky texture. It might be another one for boat texture. That sort of thing. That make sense? If it does, that's great. Any questions? Okay, well there is time then to complete this lecture and talk a little bit about how that K-means clustering algorithm works. So as I say, recall this problem of unsupervised clustering I spoke about in week 2, where given a set of data, we try to partition it into groups, what we call clusters, based on the shape of that distribution. In this case, as I say, the K-means algorithm is an algorithm where you tell the algorithm how many clusters you want to form out of the data, how many groups you want to form. So you tell it the K. So in fact, this is an example of the semi-supervised classification, where you know how many groups you want. So how does the K-means clustering algorithm work? Well, it's best illustrated with a sort of animated example. Let's suppose that instead of this high-dimensional feature space, we're working in a 2-dimensional feature space, and here are my features, my points of data. In this example, we're going to do K-means clustering where K equals 2. So we're trying to group this data, these points here in green, into 2 clusters. The first step of the K-means clustering algorithm is to pick 2 points in that space at random. So let's pick them here and here. They're going to be our cluster centers for the data. We'll call them blue and red. There's 2 of them because K equals 2. They're just picked completely at random, and they need not even be data points. They're just random points in the space. The next step is we're going to, we call assign each of these data points to a cluster center based on the cluster center it's closest to. Okay? So these points are closer to this cluster center than to this cluster center, so they go red, and these points here are all assigned to blue. Okay? We're now going to update the cluster center location by averaging the position of all of the points assigned to each cluster center. So all the red points, I'm going to average their location together to get a new position for my red cluster center, and I'm going to do the same to blue. So those cluster centers will now be updated and move, if you like, to a new location in that space. Okay? Those means then that they become the new cluster centers, and then we just iterate around the whole process again. So we do the assignment step again. We then calculate the new position of the cluster center again from the mean of those assigned points, and so on. And we iterate that process until the cluster centers don't move anymore. at which point we say the algorithm has converged, or alternatively we stop after a certain large number of iterations. So at that point, the cluster center then defines the center of, well, the cluster of each group of data. So each one of those clusters in our bag of visual words example describes a code word, one of the bins in our frequency histogram. Yeah? So you can see how it's like a super simple algorithm for clustering, but it actually works quite well in practice. It is sensitive, though, to the initialization of those points that are picked at random. So you can get different results each time you run it, which means it's a non-deterministic algorithm. So here's an example, and this is an example you get to play with in the lab code next week, where the lab code generates, in this case, 5 clusters by sampling from 5 random Gaussian distributions. It then takes all of those points just purely as x, y, without any annotation as to which cluster they belong to, feeds them into the k-means clustering algorithm, and then presents the results. So the color coding here has been automatically recovered from the two-dimensional distribution of the points only. So this is a success example of a k-means clustering. In this example here, we've tried to cluster that data using only 3 clusters instead of 5. So you can see what's happened is the k-means clustering algorithm has merged some of the clusters. It also hasn't helped in this case that some of the clusters are quite close together and become merged anyway. So, has anyone got any questions about k-means clustering algorithm there? So that is one of the steps then in this bag of visual words framework. Let's just recap that framework one final time before we end. In the bag of visual words framework, we take a bunch of images, which is like our training data that we want to build this representation from. It might be our data set we want to index for search. We detect interest points in all the images, and then for each interest point, we create a little digital fingerprint using some kind of feature extractor. Okay, it might be something like an edge orientation histogram that you compute local to that point, for example. In practice, we tend to use a descriptor, or descriptors like, for example, the SIFT descriptor is a common one. And next lecture I'm going to talk about that. But in any case, there's a way of taking a digital fingerprint of the content around that key point, that interest point, and mapping it as the point in a high-dimensional feature space. We do that for every feature in every image on our data set to create a massive distribution of points, and then we run the k-means algorithm on it to cluster those points. Those clusters then become the code words for which we build our frequency histogram. And for every image, we build a frequency histogram. To do that, we figure out which of these which of the code words each interest point falls into to create this count. And then we normalize this histogram by dividing by the area underneath it to create a set of histogram bin heights that we concatenate into a big long vector which becomes our image descriptor. So you can see that the point of the visual words pipeline, the bag of visual words pipeline, has been to take those individual little patches, those individual image descriptors, and aggregate them to form a single image descriptor, for the whole image, without assuming anything about the ordering of those points in the image. Yeah? So, depending on the feature that you compute local to these points, you can get different levels of affine invariance, i.e. sensitivity to shift, rotation, and scaling of the image. And we'll talk a lot more about that next time. So in summary then, we have looked at this role of sparse interest point detection, key point detection, and its role in visual search. We've seen in detail how the Harris corner detector lets us identify these interest points. And actually we haven't looked at SIFT, so ignore that, sorry. We've looked at the bag of visual words paradigm and how we can aggregate these local descriptors cut around these interest points to produce a global image descriptor for the image, and how that could then be integrated into a visual search system, therefore. And we've also looked in a little bit of detail at the k-means clustering algorithm, which is one component of that bag of visual words system. And as I say, there's more detail on this in one of the course texts. Okay, that's everything we got to cover today, so thank you very much.